Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be tackling the news cycle, focusing on climate change and energy policy and the environment. We've got articles from sources like the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Daily Climate,
Absolutely.
ready to extract some knowledge nuggets and connect the dots.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, first up, climate change impacts. It's not just a future threat, it's playing out right now in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
The LA Times had this article about skiers. More people are heading into the backcountry, because the resorts are so crowded.
Right.
Which means they're facing a higher risk of avalanches.
It's a fascinating example of how climate change impacts kind of ripple outwards. Crowded resorts are partly due to shorter, less reliable snow seasons, so it pushes people into riskier terrain.
Yeah, and the risks extend far beyond ski slopes. Clients Daily has a report on accelerating glacier melt. Researchers are saying it's sped up significantly since the 2000s, especially in the Alps and Pyrenees.
This is a major concern. Melting glaciers contribute to rising sea levels and impact water resources for millions. The implications are global, but they also hit close to home.
Right here in California, the New York Times has a piece about a new map showing where land movement is accelerating.
Wow.
This is leading to road damage and even home collapses.
It's a stark reminder that climate change isn't just about distant glaciers. It's impacting infrastructure and daily life in very real ways.
And then there's the impact on wildlife. Science Daily also reported on a study about algae on the Greenland ice sheet. It seems they can store nutrients who could allow them to spread, darken the ice, and accelerate melting.
Another feedback loop where a small change amplifies the problem. It's similar to what's happening with eastern monarch butterflies, which are delaying their fall migration due to climate change, according to another Science Daily article. And this disruption to their life cycle could have cascading effects on the ecosystem.
So we're seeing these interconnected impacts on a global scale, but let's zoom in on the political landscape because that's shaping how we respond to these challenges. The LA Times had this rather pointed piece lamenting the lack of climate change themes in this year's Oscar-nominated films.
It's an interesting observation. If even Hollywood, known for tackling big issues, is shunning away from climate change, it speaks to the challenge of bringing it into the mainstream cultural conversation.
Yeah, maybe they're afraid of alienating audiences, but it does seem like a missed opportunity to engage people on such a critical issue.
Right.
Speaking of missed opportunities, the Daily Climate had a series of articles about the Trump administration's actions on climate change and energy policy. And well, let's just say it's not a very hopeful picture.
Yeah, there's definitely a pattern emerging here. One article detailed how the administration halted New York City's congestion toll, citing burdens on working-class Americans and small businesses.
Which on the surface might sound reasonable, but critics see it as a setback for local efforts to combat climate change.
Exactly, and it's part of a larger trend. Another article reported all the administration's use of emergency permits to fast-track fossil fuel projects, potentially limiting environmental reviews and public input.
It seems like they're prioritizing short-term economic gains over long-term environmental concerns.
And the trend continues with the approval of a deepwater oil export terminal off the coast of Freeport, Texas. This terminal will be able to ship up to 2 million barrels of crude oil per day.
So it's more fossil fuel infrastructure, despite the known risks, and the urgent need to transition to cleaner energy sources.
And it's not just about specific projects, it's also about staffing and priorities within agencies. The Daily Climate reported on the firing of thousands of probationary employees at the Interior Department, including staff from the National Park Service and other agencies.
This raises concerns about the capacity of these agencies to manage and protect our natural resources, especially in the face of climate change.
And even more concerning is the Daily Climate's reporting on the targeting of FEMA employees involved in climate change equity and environmental justice programs.
It suggests a deliberate attempt to silence those voices within the administration and undermine efforts to address the disproportionate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities.
Another article highlighted the freezing of funding for clean energy initiatives from the Inflation Reduction Act. This has stalled solar projects in Indiana, particularly those aimed at bringing solar power to low-income communities.
It's a blow to both environmental and social justice goals. And this pattern isn't limited to the U.S. The Daily Climate also had a piece about French President Emmanuel Macron facing backlash for efforts to weaken EU environmental regulations.
He's arguing for a regulatory break to boost European businesses, but critics say he's caving to industry pressure and undermining the EU's commitment to green policies.
So we're seeing this push and pull between economic concerns and environmental priorities playing out on a global scale. It's a complex landscape, and it's hard to see any easy answers.
It is complex, but there are glimmers of hope. We'll delve into some potential solutions and positive developments in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned for that. We'll be right back.
Let's explore some potential solutions and positive developments, because amidst these challenges, there are glimmers of hope.
That's right, it's not all doom and gloom. The environmental blog had a piece highlighting reforestation initiatives as an effective way to combat climate change.
Yeah, planting trees is a natural solution that makes a lot of sense. Trees absorb carbon dioxide, so increasing forest cover can help mitigate climate change.
Plus, reforestation has benefits beyond carbon sequestration, like it can improve biodiversity, protect watersheds, and even create jobs.
Exactly, it's a multifaceted solution. And it's not just about planting trees, it's about restoring entire ecosystems. Speaking of multifaceted solutions, Science Daily reported on some promising developments in carbon capture technology.
This is fascinating stuff. One study described a new method for transforming industrial CO2 emissions into renewable fuels like methanol. Imagine turning pollution into fuel.
Yeah, it's a game changer if it can be scaled up. It highlights the potential for innovation to address the climate challenge.
And it's not just high-tech solutions. Science Daily also reported on researchers who have discovered a way to turn common minerals into materials that capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rapidly and cheaply.
This is potentially groundbreaking. Imagine being able to remove CO2 directly from the air using readily available materials. It's still in the early stages, but it offers a lot of promise.
So we've got natural solutions like reforestation and technological solutions like carbon capture, all working together to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's encouraging to see these diverse approaches gaining traction.
It's a sign that we're starting to take this challenge seriously. And there's more good news. Science Daily also had an article about research suggesting that we can increase seafood farming sustainably to help feed the planet.
This is important because it addresses the challenge of food security in a way that minimizes environmental impact. We need to find ways to feed a growing population without further depleting our natural resources.
Sustainable aquaculture could be a key part of the solution. And it's not just about producing more food, it's about doing it in a way that protects biodiversity and ecosystems.
So we're seeing progress on multiple fronts, from reforestation to carbon capture to sustainable food production. But there are still a lot of challenges ahead, especially when it comes to navigating the political landscape and overcoming entrenched interests.
Absolutely. The road to a sustainable future won't be easy, but these positive developments give us reason to be optimistic. We have the knowledge, the technology, and the resources to make a difference. It's a matter of mobilizing the political will and public support to make it happen.
Well, that's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in this. It's not just about waiting for governments or corporations to act. It's about individual actions, collective efforts, and holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. Every action counts, from making sustainable choices in our daily lives to advocating for policy changes that promote a cleaner, healthier future.
And on that note, let's turn our attention back to some specific news stories that highlight the ongoing struggle to address climate change and its impacts.
Okay, sounds good. What caught your eye?
Well, the LA Times had this article about the aftermath of the California wildfires. It seems FEMA rejected a request by the governor's office to test soil and fire areas for toxic contaminants.
That's concerning. Wildfires release a lot of hazardous materials into the environment, and it's important to assess the risks to public health, especially for residents trying to rebuild.
Exactly. And there's also this LA Times opinion piece that really resonated with me. It argued that we need to treat California wildfires as a collective challenge rather than isolated incidents.
I think that's a crucial point. The impacts of wildfires extend far beyond the immediate damage. They affect air quality, water resources, and even the mental health of communities. It's a shared burden that requires a coordinated response.
And speaking of shared burdens, the Daily Climate had a piece about how former President Trump's pro-fossil fuel stance is influencing global energy policies. It seems like decisions made in one country can have ripple effects around the world.
It's a reminder that we're all interconnected. The article highlights how countries like Indonesia, Argentina, and South Africa are signaling that they may delay emissions reductions or even withdraw from climate agreements, citing the U.S.'s continued fossil fuel expansion under the Trump administration as justification.
So they're essentially saying if the U.S. isn't taking climate action seriously, why should we? It's a dangerous precedent that could undermine global efforts to address this crisis.
Absolutely. And it's not just countries. The article mentions how energy companies like Equinor and BP are also scaling back investments in renewables while increasing oil and gas production.
It's a worrying trend. It suggests that short-term economic interests are still trumping long-term sustainability, even in the face of mounting evidence about the urgency of the climate crisis.
It's a classic example of the disconnect between what we know we need to do and what we're actually doing. But it's important to remember that this is not a done deal. There are people and organizations fighting for change, advocating for cleaner energy, and pushing for policies that prioritize the health of our planet.
That's a good point. And speaking of those fighting for change, the Daily Climate had this article about a new pipeline project in Texas that will expand natural gas supply despite climate concerns. It seems like there's a lot of pushback from environmental groups.
This project highlights the ongoing struggle to transition to a clean energy economy. The pipeline, called the Trident Intrastate Pipeline, will transport an additional 1.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily from the Permian Basin to Texas's Port Arthur Industrial Corridor.
So it's a major expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, even though we know we need to be moving away from those sources.
Exactly. And while natural gas is often touted as a cleaner alternative to coal, it still emits carbon dioxide when burned, and it releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas, through leaks in production and transport infrastructure.
So this project is a step in the wrong direction, both in terms of climate change and the message it sends about our commitment to a sustainable future.
It's a stark reminder of the challenges we face. But it's also a call to action. We need to keep pushing for cleaner energy solutions, holding our leaders accountable, and demanding that they prioritize the long-term health of our planet over short-term economic gains.
Well said. And speaking of holding leaders accountable, the Daily Climate had this piece about Japan's changing energy strategy. It seems they're aiming to cut greenhouse gas emissions by a whopping 73% from 2013 levels by 2040.
That's a bold target, and it's encouraging to see a major economy setting such an ambitious goal. But here's where it gets interesting. Their plan involves boosting renewables to 40–50% of electricity by 2040, which is great, but it also involves restarting nearly all of their nuclear reactors.
So they're reversing their post-Fukushima phase-out of nuclear power. That's a controversial move considering the risks associated with nuclear accidents and waste disposal.
Absolutely. It's a high-stakes gamble. They're betting on nuclear power to help them meet their climate goals, but it's a bet that could face significant hurdles.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Their success or failure could have implications for other countries considering nuclear power as part of their energy mix.
It's a reminder that there are no easy answers when it comes to the energy transition. Every option has its pros and cons, and we need to carefully weigh the risks and benefits.
Okay, let's talk about another development that highlights the challenges of implementing climate solutions. The Daily Climate has a piece about California backing off its electric truck mandate. It seems like they're facing pushback from the trucking industry and concerns about the feasibility of the transition.
This is a good example of how even well-intentioned policies can face real-world challenges and political obstacles. The high cost of electric trucks' long charging times and limited charging infrastructure made widespread adoption difficult, especially for small trucking businesses.
I can see how those would be major barriers. It's not as simple as just flipping a switch.
Exactly. And there was also concern that the federal government under President Trump would reject the mandate, so California decided to withdraw it.
So they backed down due to political pressure and practical challenges. It's a setback, but it's also a reminder that we need to be strategic and pragmatic in our approach to climate action.
Absolutely. Mandates alone may not be enough. We need a supportive environment that makes electric trucks a more attractive and feasible option for businesses. That means investing in charging infrastructure, providing financial incentives, and working collaboratively with industry to overcome the barriers to adoption.
Speaking of barriers to adoption, the Daily Climate had this piece about Brazil pushing back against a proposed global shipping tax. It's an interesting case study of how different countries view their responsibilities for addressing climate change.
It highlights the challenges of reaching international agreements on climate action when there are competing economic interests at stake. The International Maritime Organization is considering a carbon levy on international shipping with the goal of generating billions of dollars to help developing nations address climate change.
That sounds like a good idea. Shipping is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and it makes sense for the industry to contribute to climate action.
It does. But not everyone agrees. Brazil, China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries are opposing the tax, arguing that it would disproportionately impact developing nations and increase economic inequality.
I can see their point. The cost of the tax would likely be passed down to consumers, potentially affecting food prices and other essential goods.
It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we need to hold the shipping industry accountable for its emissions and generate funding to support climate action, particularly in developing countries that are most vulnerable to its impacts. On the other hand, we need to ensure that any solutions we implement don't exacerbate existing inequalities or create new ones.
It's a delicate balancing act, and it highlights the need for thoughtful, nuanced approaches that consider the economic and social impacts of climate policies, both within and between countries.
You're right. We can't address climate change in isolation. We need to consider the broader context, the interconnectedness of these issues, and the potential consequences of our actions, both intended and unintended.
Well, that's a good reminder as we navigate this complex landscape. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll wrap up our analysis of the day's news and leave you with some food for thought. We've covered a lot of ground today, from melting glaciers to political maneuvering to hopeful innovations. It's clear that the climate crisis is a complex and multifaceted challenge, with no easy answers.
Yeah, we've seen examples of short-term thinking clashing with the need for long-term sustainability and the difficulty of balancing economic interests with environmental concerns. But amidst the challenges, there are also glimmers of hope.
The Daily Climate had a piece about the EU's new Clean Industrial Deal, which aims to position the EU as a global leader in the circular economy by 2030. It's an ambitious plan that seeks to move away from the traditional linear economic model of take, make, dispose towards a more sustainable approach.
This is a significant development. The plan includes measures to accelerate renewable energy adoption, simplify permitting processes for clean energy projects, and promote hydrogen as an alternative to fossil fuels in hard-to-decarbonize industries.
So while there are some concerns about financing and implementation, it's encouraging to see a major economic bloc taking such a bold step. However, the path to a cleaner future isn't always smooth. The Daily Climate also had a story about a top prosecutor in Washington, D.C., resigning amid a probe into Biden climate funding.
This story highlights the unfortunate reality that climate action has become politicized. The prosecutor, Denise Chung, was reportedly asked to investigate the funding of nonprofit organizations distributing money from the Inflation Reduction Act to climate change mitigation programs.
Oh, wow. It raises concerns about whether these investigations are truly about accountability or simply attempts to undermine climate initiatives.
Yeah, the politicization of climate change is a major obstacle. It diverts resources, creates uncertainty, and erodes public trust. We need to move beyond partisan battles and focus on solutions that benefit everyone.
Speaking of solutions, remember that LA Times opinion piece we discussed earlier, the one arguing that we need to treat California wildfires as a collective challenge? Well, the Daily Climate had a related piece about the EPA's wildfire debris cleanup plan in Los Angeles, and it's causing quite a stir.
The EPA's decision to use a popular beach as a staging site for toxic wildfire debris has sparked protests and concerns about potential contamination. Residents are worried about exposure to hazardous materials, and experts warn that improper handling could spread contaminants into the ocean, groundwater, and surrounding communities.
It's another example of the complex decisions that need to be made as we grapple with the impacts of climate change, balancing the urgency of cleanup efforts with the need to protect public health and the environment is a delicate task.
And it underscores the importance of community engagement and transparency in the decision-making process. People need to have a voice in how these issues are addressed, especially when their health and well-being are at stake.
So what can we take away from all of this? We've seen setbacks, hopeful developments, and ongoing struggles. It's clear that the climate crisis isn't going away, and addressing it will require sustained effort, innovation, and collaboration on a global scale.
It's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make choices in our daily lives that reduce our impact, support businesses and organizations that are working towards solutions, and hold our leaders accountable for making decisions that prioritize a sustainable future.
And we need to stay informed, engage in these conversations, and never lose sight of the fact that the choices we make today will shape the world we leave for future generations.
We hope this deep dive has provided you with some valuable insights and perhaps even sparked some ideas for how you can contribute to creating a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable future.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.